All right, welcome to our presentation today. My name is David Hill. I'm a senior consultant with Eastridge. This is a re-recording of a presentation performed at the Eastridge Back to SharePoint School in both Charlotte and in Durham by Thomas Nichols, the CTO at Eastridge, and by myself. Today we're going to be talking about SharePoint 2013 navigation, some of the options available to you both on-premise and primarily in the cloud. We're going to talk about the Suite Bar. What is it? How do you customize it? We're going to talk a little bit about TopNav, some of the common uses for it, some of the ways that you might customize it. We're going to do a bunch of code demos, and well, because this is a recording, there won't be any questions. So what's the Suite Bar? The SharePoint Suite Bar is used for branding, primarily company logo, the name. You may add your custom color to that primary color in the top. The most common requirement that we get from our customers is to add global links to intranets, for example, project portals, team sites, the extranet. So it's a good piece of real estate just to put a bunch of links that you want to have globally available to all your users across various farm web applications, for example. The anatomy of the bar, relatively simple, and we got here the bars for both Office 365 and the on-premise SharePoint 2013 Suite Bar. Suite Bar itself is the whole area. It's not just the blue section. Suite Bar left and Suite Bar right. And so it's actually broken down. And if you were to look in the HTML, you would see that the IDs of these sections are in fact Suite Bar left and Suite Bar right. So when you're coming back to do some jQuery later, this is going to be useful. Inside the Suite Bar, we've got the branding box, the links, the Suite links, the welcome menu box where you might have all of you'd expect to find your typical My Sites, My Settings, SharePoint drop down, and then the bar buttons where that's going to be site settings, site actions. And then if you're just curious, that gray section below is actually the ribbon box that you're used to seeing with both 2010, 2013. It's got the browse, the page ribbons, and then some of the new 2013 features, share, follow, sync, etc. So there are some slight differences between on-premise and Office 365 SharePoint Online. As you can see, on-premise, you just get, by default, SharePoint in a little div in that section. In SharePoint Online, it uses the Office 365 logo, and that logo is actually sourced from a composite image. It's a fairly common practice these days, and there's a sprite behind that. You can see the Office 365 logo embedded in that sprite. So how would we customize it? On-premise, it's relatively simple. We'd use PowerShell like we do for a lot of our customizations. Make sure that you have the SharePoint PowerShell snap-in available with add PS snap-in. And then we're going to get the web application. And in this case, we're just going to echo the Suite Bar branding element HTML property of the web app. And as you can see, it's just a div with a class on it, and it contains the text SharePoint. Now, for our example, we're going to spice that up a little bit. We're going to add a bunch of links to it, and really all we're doing here is adding a bunch more divs. We're creating an outer div, or a series of divs: the Eastridge, the portal site, the extranet site, the launch site, and the My Sites. And we're marking those up with some out-of-the-box CSS classes, MS Core SweetLink-A, to make sure that they get the right branding. They get a little hover, they have the right color. In this PowerShell script, we're doing the same thing. We're getting the SP web application for the web app, and then we are setting the Suite Bar branding element HTML property to that branding variable, and then just calling update. And the result is a nice series of links to our Eastridge resources: Eastridge, Portal, Extranet, Launch, and My Site. Now, that's kind of cool. I mean, it's useful. It's not very interesting because it doesn't have any real animation to it or any pizzazz, but it does serve the requirements properly. What if we wanted to extend this a little bit, maybe use the real estate a little bit better, have the ability to add more links, or maybe make it a little more dynamic? So we had a demo to show you how to actually do that PowerShell, but I think you get the idea. We're going to skip that. How would we customize it with SharePoint Online? Well, we can't do it with PowerShell, right? PowerShell is not an option with SharePoint Online. That's not a PowerShell commandlet that's available to us. We can't get the web app, for example. So we can customize it using JavaScript and CSS. We'd like it to be very dynamic and interactive. More importantly, we'd like to make it look like, for example, Outlook.com. We want to make it look like with use an interface that users are already familiar with. So let me show you a demo of Outlook.com if you're not familiar with that. They have this nice little, this is not SharePoint. It looks kind of like SharePoint. You got a sweep bar style here. We have our nice little Outlook logo and a drop down, and then we get links to your Outlook resources, right? Get your people, you have your calendar. It's a really good use of this real estate. Your SkyDrive. Okay, so it's a nice little switcher. You could fit a lot of links in there, as you can see. So maybe there's a way we could make SharePoint Online look like that in its sweep bar. Here's an example of Outlook.com for those of you that don't have it. So I'm going to show you a demo of how we actually did that. Now, what I did is I built in our demo site here, I use jQuery. jQuery is the kind of the magic sauce that allows us to control whatever we want on this page. I have some scripts that run master page edits, import my scripts. My scripts run on load and modify what appears in this top left area. So essentially I'm just inserting a div, I'm inserting a reference to our image, I'm inserting another div with some a little style in there for the arrow, and then some JavaScript, and then we get a nice little hover drop down. The whole thing is sourced off of this suite nav items list, which is a little bit more configurable and gives the user some control over where these items. Oh gosh. Go back. Let's do those over again. Let's do the demo over again. Yeah, let's go back to here. So I'm going to show you a demo of the modification that we made to our SharePoint Online site. This modification was made using JavaScript and jQuery. So we modified the master page to load some custom scripts, and the scripts simply run some jQuery commands that replace what appears in the top left corner with our logo, a little drop down area here, and as you can see, we get a nice little responsive and configurable UI. Now the links that actually appear in here, these tiles, are dynamic. They're configured by a SharePoint list that I had created, a custom list, a very simple list called Suite Nav Items, title, the image URL, the link URL. And as you can see, this is responsive. So if I edit one of the items, and I add in some twos here, for all you gaming fans, we get a slightly different Portal 2. Pretty cool. Okay, so how do we do that? Let's go back to the slides and walk through the code. Now, in this case, we're using SharePoint Designer to develop this solution. The great thing about this is that the APIs that we're using, the CSOM API, this is available now. So even for users that are on SharePoint 2010, or maybe they're on an Office 365 tenant that hasn't been upgraded to SharePoint 2013, or SharePoint 2013 on-premise and in the cloud, this option is available in all those cases. So essentially what we're doing is creating a solution that is really just a collection of files stored in an organized way. In my case, I decided to store them in the site assets library of our site. I could have just as easily put them in the master pages catalog as a subfolder. The main thing is that you create a pattern in your organization and then you follow that pattern across all your developers so that the results are consistent. In addition, I had to make a master page change. So as we all know, when we make master page changes, we don't want to edit the out-of-the-box master. I created a copy of Seattle.master called eastridge.seattle.master, and that's the master page that I added my lines to. So we'll talk a little bit about the binding architecture here. This is where we're going to get a little bit deep into some JavaScript, but I think this is important to understand. As we're building these kind of in-page applications, the primary, the underlying layer is the data. Right? We have data sources. Those could be web services. They could be SharePoint CSOM. Maybe they're the search API or web services provided by SharePoint. Regardless, we need some way to get objects. We need some way to get data from our sources, something to render. So in our case, we're using the SharePoint CSOM API to get list items from my Suite Nav Items list. I'm going to run a query against that list, and for every item that I get back, I'm going to push it into this JavaScript view model, which is essentially just exactly what it sounds like. It's a JavaScript object full of other objects. This is the thing that we're going to then bind to with Knockout at that second layer. If you're not familiar with Knockout, we're going to get a little bit more detail coming up here on what Knockout is and how it works. And then the ultimate output is that rendered HTML. So we're basically mixing together the Knockout binding and the JavaScript view model to come up with our rendered HTML output. So, as a matter of pattern, I want to talk about the JavaScript closure. This is kind of where we're building our framework for the scripts that we're going to create. In this case, as a matter of pattern, I'm creating an Easter edge namespace, var Easter edge equals, and I'm getting window.easteredge if it already exists, or I'm getting a new object if it doesn't. What this allows me to do is reference the same namespace in many script files and make sure that I get the namespace if it already exists, or create a new one. Therefore, I won't walk on someone else's namespace. That was rough. And then I'm creating a sub namespace called SweetBar within the Easter edge namespace. Same technique. Now we're going to use an anonymous self-invoking function to actually configure what easteredge.sweetbar is and does. So we're passing in easteredge.sweetbar as a parameter. It comes in as SB to this anonymous function. And then we're setting things on SB, like the init function. SB.init equals a function. We're going to do stuff here. Now this is really just declaration. It doesn't actually do anything until we invoke it. And we're going to invoke it when the page is ready. So I want to wait until document.ready before I do my stuff, but I also want to wait until the SharePoint JavaScripts are loaded. So Microsoft has provided for us a utility function called execute or delay until script loaded, waits until a specific script is available, in this case sp.js, where all the CSOM stuff is declared, and then it invokes our easteredge.sweetbar.init function that we had declared previously. So we're making sure that we're coming in the right place in the page load order so that our code will function properly. Now we're going to go a little bit more detail into what that init function might do. As you can see here, we're declaring the context, a CTX, and the list items outside of the function. We're also declaring, this is the first taste of Knockout, an array, actually observable array called SweetBar items. Now, within sp.init, we want to initialize that context to the current context. And you folks that are familiar with developing firm solutions with .NET, this code is going to look pretty familiar to you. We need to get the context of the site that we're in. We need to get the current web from that context. And then we want to get the appropriate list based on the title. So we got a variable here, list, get by title, suite nav items. This is the custom list that I had created in the site. Well, now we need to query the list, and how we do that is with a camel query. So in this case, the query itself is dumb. It doesn't care. We want all the items, so we don't have to specify any actual clauses in that query. We're just getting everything, and we're going to get the items using that camel query into a variable called list items. Now, list items isn't useful yet because we haven't actually loaded it yet, and everything in CSOM is asynchronous. So what we're doing here is we're really telling the context how we want it to load the items that we care about, and which items we care about, frankly. So here we're saying, all right, now load list items. We really want to look at and inspect list items. That won't happen until we call execute query async on the context. And then we have two outcomes, either success or failure. These are callback functions that are going to be defined elsewhere. So hopefully we get a success. Hopefully query success is executed. And here's that query success definition. In this case, this is the boilerplate for what you might do in query success. We're going to get an enumerator from that list items collection. We're going to walk the enumerator with move next. And then for every item in the enumerator, which gets packed into this list item variable, we're going to inspect it using the get item function. The parameter of that function is the field name that we care about, in this case the title. If you create a custom list and you have custom fields, then you need to know exactly what those internal field names are so that you can evaluate them properly. This also leads back to, as a matter of pattern, designing your custom lists with nice simple field names that don't have extra spaces or characters in them, so it's relatively easy to code against them without having to worry about %20s and underscore, etc. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do with that JavaScript. We need to bind it somehow, right? And so Knockout gives us a way to template HTML. The four major properties of Knockout are its ability to do declarative bindings. In other words, the bindings are declared within the HTML and not in code. Automatic UI refresh, so as that underlying the binding objects change, JavaScript or Knockout manages the synchronization of the UI to show those changes. Dependency tracking and templating. So we're going to populate our view model. Knockout needs a view model to bind to, and we're going to populate it in this function. This is exactly what would appear within that query success method we saw on a previous slide. We're going to go into a little more detail of how we might work with that enumerator. In this case, we want to create a new item, a new JavaScript object for every SharePoint list item that we get back. And this is just a sort of a JSON notation for creating items. We're setting the title property, the image URL property, and the link URL property to the title field, the value of the image URL field, and the link URL field. We got a little extra text in here that's going to get evaluated because of the way the image URL is used. It's used as a background image. But the main thing to focus on here is we're just getting the field properties, get item, get item, get item. And then for every new item that we create, we push it into that sweepbar items observable array that you saw in a previous slide. But nothing happens until we call apply bindings. So this allows us to, query and then initialize our arrays all in advance. When we're satisfied that our view model is properly set up, then we call apply bindings, passing in the view model SB. And we're going to also, in this case, they're going to pass in the HTML DOM element that we actually care about binding to, which is our ER header bar. So we're explicitly saying bind this JavaScript data to this template HTML. So what's a ER header bar? Well, that's an ID. That's an ID of a div. This is actually one of the changes that I had to make to the master page. This is the Knockout section of the master page for the suite nav. ID is ER header bar. And what we have here is a UL, an unordered list full of LIs. Well, here's the first data binding that you've seen. Data bind for each suite bar item. So for every item in this suite bar items observable array, we're going to create an LI. And within that LI, we're going to get an anchor tag, and we're going to bind the link URL to the href attribute of that anchor tag using this special data bind syntax. Likewise, we're going to put a span in there. This is where that image URL comes in. You can see it's in a background image of the style property, the style attribute. And we're going to bind the title to the text of a span underneath it. So that's how the text appears. We got one more little span here. This is just a spacer that makes things line up properly. All right, so let's talk a little bit about top nav. You've seen sweetbar navigation, which is really the global nav that you might use for, again, top level links across many different web applications in your farm. Top nav is a special place in SharePoint, and it's been there since the beginning, right? Navigation has been useful since the beginning, and there's a lot of out-of-the-box navs that we can take advantage of. But we found that we have a common set of requirements that often come up from our customers, and these requirements often push us past what the out-of-the-box navigation allows us to do. It forces us into a path where we end up with custom nav. So here's some common requirements that we get from our customers. We might want to allow all sites in the portal to have the same nav, so we don't want to share navigation across all site collections or show sites from other site collections within a site collection, rolling them across as opposed to rolling things up. Maybe we don't want it to be based on the explicit site structure of the site. Maybe we want to have a more arbitrary organization of our links and not just have it mapped directly to the structure of the site. This allows us some great power in the way that we organize the architecture of sites if we're not really concerned about making it mesh with some nav somewhere. Maybe we'll want to have multiple drop downs or flyouts, multiple levels of flyouts. And there's only a few that you can get out of the box, and the way that it works is kind of static. So, any modifications to that is going to end up with a custom CSS. So you're going to be in custom territory again. Maybe you want to have column headers and sublinks in a wide versus tall formation, sort of like a mega menu. Other additional branding and styling requirements or components. Adding a background image or a watermark, for example, to the flyout menu. Oftentimes folks want these to be centrally managed so that you don't have to go manage your navigation on every subsite within a site collection. And most importantly, almost always you want your navigation to be security trimmed. The only time when it doesn't really matter is with a public facing site where it's always anonymous. But for most intranet scenarios, you're going to have different levels of security at different levels of the site. And so you wouldn't want to show links to users that would end up with an access denied page. So one example of this, and what we've done, I'm going to kind of run through this quickly, but we've built a mega menu navigation using, again, the same CSOM list querying technique, in this case with a lot more texture. We're breaking things apart by departments, by projects. We've got subheaders for accounting and finance, the different departments, for example, in the departments collection. And then within each little silo, we've got links. So let's go back to our demo here. This is, you can see the flyout in action. It's really nice, and it's a really good use of space, wide instead of tall. You can fit a lot of links in a small space. In this case, the source data for this is the top nav items list, SharePoint list. Very similar to suite nav items, but we needed the extra texture to put in categories and subheaders. But you could imagine a user possibly managing this. In a production scenario, though, I don't know that I would be satisfied with having all of my links sourced from a list like this. For one thing, this isn't going to be security trimmed. So this would be good for a public-facing website, but might not work too well for an intranet. And we're going to go into some. I'll go into an option for sourcing data from another source coming up here. But first, I want to do a little demo of actually how this was built. Real quickly, this kind of just shows extra detail of how the top nav knockout binding works. Same approach as the suite nav. We just have more contact, or it's more complex, more data. So you can see that as each level comes in, the bindings that mesh to each level. This is our navigation matrix here. Some of the requirements, how they mesh up with the different solutions, and we just tried to brainstorm what the most common requirements that we received were, what the out-of-the-box versus the most common custom solutions that you might come up with, and how these things mesh together. And as you can see, there's one column here that really stands out. It's sourcing data from search. So the search API as a data source kind of satisfies all these requirements, especially the security trimming, especially cross-site collection. So what search allows us to do is, and I'm going to show you a quick demo of something that you can try now even in your SharePoint 2010, 2013 sites. Search allows us to use managed properties and crawled properties to do very targeted searches for very specific kinds of results. In this case, I'm going to get all the results of content class STS site. And what this shows me is all the sites in my tenant that this user, David Hill, has access to. These aren't pages, these aren't webs, these are specifically sites in the site collection. Now, I could easily query for this data using the search web service and then use these links. I've got the title, I've got the link, I've got everything I need to build navigation out of this to easily source this as the data for my flyout mega menu. So this is a good example of how search might shine as a data source. And the beauty of search is it's an index that's created automatically in the crawl. It's incremental to the, it's granular to the timing of your incremental crawl. So if you have a crawl set for 15 minutes, you know that if you add a new site, within 15 minutes, it's going to show up in the navigation. And of course, it's security trimmed. It's not going to show links to the current user that they're not allowed to see. So it's naturally security trimmed across the entirety of the content sources. So here's some extra resources that we're going to include. These are in the slides that will be included. This is a little playground in JS Fiddle. This little playground allows you to kind of mess with bindings, mess with the view model, have some JavaScript code you can actually tweak to modify this. I recommend you check that out. Knockoutjs.com has some excellent documentation, which you will really enjoy. And the mega menu dropdown that I utilized was this Design Chemical jQuery add-in that just does a really nice job of styling some relatively simple HTML to build that mega menu. So I appreciate you being with me today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Have a nice day.